On the night of August 8, 2013, a 26-year-old father of four made a frantic 911 call from a desolate Texas highway, his voice breathless and panicked as he spoke of men chasing him through the darkness. And then he vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a 3-minute recording that has haunted investigators, obsessed internet sleuths, and tortured his family for over a decade, until a discovery in February 2022 would finally bring answers, but raise even more questions about what really happened on that terrifying night in the middle of nowhere. Before we dive in, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another case that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Brandon Mason Lawson was born into a working-class Texas family, the kind of people who understood that nothing in life comes easy, that every dollar has to be earned through sweat and determination. That family is the foundation upon which everything else is built. He grew up in Texas, surrounded by the landscape that would one day become the site of his mysterious disappearance. Endless horizons, wide open skies, stretches of highway that could make you feel both infinitely free and terrifyingly isolated at the same time. The Texas landscape has a way of shaping the people who grow up in it, instilling in them a particular kind of resilience, a practical approach to life's challenges, and an understanding that sometimes you're on your own out there, under that big sky. Brandon's childhood was typical for a Texas kid from a working family. He learned early about hard work, about responsibility, about the value of family bonds that could sustain you through difficult times. His father worked hard to provide for the family, instilling in Brandon the understanding that being a man meant showing up, doing your job, taking care of your own. These were values that Brandon would carry with him into adulthood, values that would define his identity as a father and partner, even as he struggled with the demons that would ultimately contribute to his tragic end. By 2013, Brandon was 26 years old and living in San Angelo, a city of about 100,000 people located in west central Texas, roughly in the center of a triangle formed by Abilene to the north, Midland to the west, and Austin to the southeast. San Angelo sits at the confluence of 3 branches of the Concho River, a geographic feature that made it an important settlement in the frontier era and continues to define the city's character today. It's a historic frontier town that has evolved over more than a century into a regional hub for ranching, agriculture, and increasingly in recent decades, oil production. The landscape around San Angelo is classic West Texas terrain: rolling plains dotted with mesquite trees, limestone hills that rise abruptly from relatively flat ground, dry creek beds that only flow during the rare heavy rains, and an ecology adapted to semi-arid conditions where water is precious and the sun beats down mercilessly for much of the year. The soil is rocky and thin in many places, better suited to grazing cattle than growing crops. The vegetation is tough and drought-resistant: prickly pear cactus, various species of scrub brush, scattered live oaks that provide islands of shade in an otherwise exposed landscape. San Angelo's economy has always been tied to what can be extracted from this harsh but beautiful land. First, it was ranching, cattle and sheep that could survive on the sparse vegetation. Then came the military, Goodfellow Air Force Base, which continues to be a major employer and presence in the community. And in more recent decades, oil production has become increasingly important, as drilling technology has improved and previously uneconomical reserves have become profitable to extract. The oil boom of the early 2000s brought new prosperity to San Angelo and surrounding communities, creating jobs that paid well by local standards and attracting workers from across Texas and beyond. Brandon worked in the oil fields, one of thousands of men in West Texas who made their living in an industry that was both lucrative and demanding, both opportunity and trap. Oilfield work is hard, physical labor that breaks down men's bodies over time, leaving them at 40 or 50 with backs that ache, knees that don't work right, hands scarred from years of handling rough equipment and sharp tools. The work involves long hours. 12-hour shifts are common, sometimes extending even longer when there's a problem at the well site that needs immediate attention. The schedules are often irregular, with workers putting in stretches of consecutive days at the job site followed by days off, a rhythm that makes maintaining normal family life challenging. The work takes men out into remote locations, to drilling sites that can be miles from the nearest town, accessible only via dirt roads that turn to mud in the rain and kick up choking clouds of dust in dry weather. These sites are loud. The constant roar of generators, the rhythmic pounding of pump jacks, the screech of metal on metal as equipment operates 24 hours a day. The smell of crude oil hangs heavy in the air, mixing with diesel fumes from the trucks and equipment. It gets into your clothes, your hair, your skin, a smell you can never quite wash away completely. Workers wear hard hats, steel-toed boots, heavy gloves, safety glasses, protective equipment that's essential, but that makes this work even more physically taxing, especially in the Texas heat where summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The jobs in the oil fields have various titles and require different skills. Roughnecks, who do the heavy manual labor, derrick hands, who work on the drilling platform, tool pushers, who supervise operations, geologists, who analyze the rock, formations, engineers who design the drilling operations, truck drivers who transport equipment, and materials. Brandon's specific role isn't detailed in most accounts of his disappearance, but what's clear is that he was doing physical work, the kind that leaves you exhausted at the end of a shift, the kind that pays enough to support a family, but demands everything you have to give. For Brandon, the oil fields were a way to provide for his family, a means to an end. He was a father of four children who depended on him, who needed him to be there, who deserved better than what life would ultimately deal them. His children's ages in 2013 ranged from young to very young, kids who were, at that stage, where every day with their father mattered, where memories were being formed that would have to last a lifetime. The oldest was probably around 12 or 13, old enough to have clear memories of their father, old enough to understand what it meant when he disappeared. The youngest was much smaller, a child who would grow up with only photographs and stories to know the father they lost. Brandon's relationship with his children was, by all accounts, loving and engaged, despite the demands of his work schedule. He was the kind of father who tried to make the most of his time off, who understood that quality time mattered when quantity was limited by work demands. He played with his kids, took them places, showed up for the important moments when he could. His children knew they were loved, knew their father was working hard for them, knew that when he was gone for those long shifts at the oil field. It was because he was trying to build a better life for them. The financial pressure of supporting a family of 6 on an oil field worker's salary was constant and wearing. While oil field work pays better than many jobs available to men without college degrees in West Texas, it's not enough to live comfortably, especially with 4 children to feed, clothe, house, and eventually educate. Every month brought bills that had to be paid, unexpected expenses that strained the budget, choices between needs that all seemed equally important. Should they fix the truck that was making that worrying noise, or could they wait another month? Could they afford new shoes for the kids when the old ones were getting tight, or could they stretch it a little longer? These were the everyday calculations of working-class life, the constant mathematics of survival that ground people down over time. Brandon's partner in navigating these challenges, in building a life and raising a family, was Lawson. By 2013, they had been together for 10 years, a decade of shared struggle and shared joy, of building something together, despite all the obstacles that life put in their path. They weren't married in the traditional sense. No wedding ceremony, no legal document. But theirs was a marriage in every way that mattered. They lived together, raised children together, made decisions together, faced the world as a unit. In Texas, after living together and presenting themselves as a married couple for a sufficient period, they would have been considered common law spouses with many of the same legal rights and responsibilities as formally married couples. Lawson was the mother of 3 of Brandon's 4 children and stepmother to his eldest daughter from a previous relationship. She worked long hours herself, contributing to the family income and trying to manage the household while Brandon was away at the oil fields. The division of labor in their relationship was probably traditional in some ways. Brandon as the primary breadwinner, doing physically demanding work. Lawson managing the home and children, but also necessarily flexible because oil field schedules don't respect conventional working hours. When Brandon was on a night shift, Lawson handled everything at home alone. When he had days off, he needed to pitch in with child care and household tasks so Lawson could get a break from the constant demands of managing 4 children. By all accounts, theirs was a relationship marked by genuine affection, by deep love, by the kind of commitment that weathers storms. They had been together through good times and bad, through periods of financial stability and periods of struggle, through Brandon's attempts to stay sober and his relapses into drug use. Lawson loved Brandon despite his flaws, stood by him through his battles with addiction, believed in the man he was trying to become even when he stumbled and fell back into old patterns. Brandon had been in a relationship with Lawson for 10 years by the time of his disappearance. They weren't married, but theirs was a common law marriage in every sense that mattered. They lived together, raised children together, navigated the challenges of life as a unit. Lawson was the mother of 3 of Brandon's 4 children and stepmother to his eldest daughter. By all accounts, theirs was a relationship marked by genuine affection, by shared struggles, by the kind of commitment that weathers storms. But 2013 had been a difficult year for Brandon and Lawson, a year that tested their relationship in ways that previous challenges hadn't. The primary stressor was time, or rather, the lack of it. The oil field work, while financially necessary for their household's survival, meant impossibly long hours for Brandon. He would leave for work before the sun came up, spend 12 or more hours at a remote well site doing backbreaking labor under the unforgiving Texas sun, and return home exhausted, barely able to eat dinner before collapsing into bed. And then he'd wake up and do it again, day after day, week after week, with only occasional days off that he desperately needed just to recover physically before the cycle started again. Ledessa also worked long hours in her own job, the specifics of which have not been publicly detailed, but which apparently involved the same kind of grinding schedule that Brandon faced. With both parents working extreme hours, both coming home exhausted, both struggling to find energy for each other and for their 4 children, the family existed in a state of constant stress and near crisis. Who would pick up the kids from school? Who would make dinner? Who would help with homework, put the little ones to bed, handle the 1,000 daily tasks that families require? These logistical challenges became sources of argument and resentment as both Brandon and Ledessa felt overwhelmed and unsupported, even though both were doing everything they could just to keep the family afloat. The stress of this lifestyle, 2 parents working themselves to exhaustion, trying to find time for each other and their children amid the relentless demands of financial survival, had created serious tension in their relationship. Arguments became more frequent. Small annoyances that could have been laughed off in better times became triggers for major conflicts. The patience and grace they needed to show each other got used up just getting through each day, leaving nothing in reserve for when things went wrong or our feelings got hurt. They were running on empty, both of them. And running on empty meant mistakes, meant tempers flaring, meant saying and doing things that damaged the relationship, even though neither of them wanted that damage. And there was something else, something that Brandon and his family would later have to acknowledge publicly, despite the stigma and shame that surrounds it, something that added another devastating layer of complexity to an already impossibly difficult situation. Brandon had been struggling with substance abuse, specifically methamphetamine addiction, for some time before his disappearance. Methamphetamine, crystal meth, crank, ice, whatever name you want to call it by, is a scourge in working-class communities across America, but it has hit rural and small-town Texas particularly hard. It's cheap relative to other drugs, it's readily available, and it promises exactly what exhausted working people desperately need: energy, alertness, the ability to work longer hours and push through physical exhaustion. For someone like Brandon, working brutal hours in the oil fields, constantly tired, constantly feeling like he wasn't doing enough for his family, constantly struggling to keep up with all the demands on his time and energy, methamphetamine would have seemed like a solution, just a little bit, to get through a particularly hard shift, just enough to stay alert when driving home late at night after a 12-hour workday, just enough to have some energy left for the kids when he got home instead of collapsing immediately. This is how addiction starts for many people. Not as a recreational choice, not as thrill-seeking behavior, but as a desperate attempt to meet legitimate demands that exceed human capacity. But methamphetamine doesn't solve problems. It creates them. The initial boost of energy and alertness comes at a terrible cost. The drug floods the brain with dopamine, creating an artificial sense of well-being and capability that masks the body's real limitations. Users can go for days without sleep, pushing themselves far beyond what's healthy or sustainable. When the drug wears off, the crash is devastating. Extreme fatigue, depression, inability to function without more of the drug. This creates a cycle where users take more meth to avoid the crash, leading to longer periods of use, worse crashes, and progressively more severe physical and psychological damage. Long-term methamphetamine use causes profound changes in the brain. It damages the neural pathways involved in memory, judgment, and emotional regulation. It causes paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations. Users often describe feeling like they're being watched or followed, like people are talking about them, like danger is everywhere, even when they're objectively safe. The drug causes what's called meth psychosis in chronic users, a state where reality becomes increasingly distorted, where users can't distinguish between genuine threats and paranoid delusions, where their behavior becomes erratic and potentially dangerous to themselves and others. Brandon had been caught in this cycle, using methamphetamine to cope with the demands of his life, then using more to cope with the damage the drug itself was causing. By early 2013, his addiction had progressed to the point where it was causing obvious problems in his life. LaDessa knew about his drug use. You can't hide methamphetamine addiction from someone you live with, not for long. The physical signs are too obvious: the rapid weight loss, the deteriorating teeth, the skin sores from picking at imaginary bugs, the manic energy followed by days of exhausted depression, the erratic behavior, and mood swings. But Brandon had managed, at some point in late 2012 or very early 2013, to get clean. He had stopped using, had gone through the hellish process of withdrawal and early recovery, had stayed sober for approximately 6 months before his disappearance. This period of sobriety represented genuine progress, real hope for the family's future. Brandon Clean was the man LaDessa had fallen in love with. Present, engaged, emotionally available, capable of being the father and partner his family needed. Those 6 months must have felt like emerging from a long nightmare, like getting their lives back, like finally having reason to believe things could get better. But addiction recovery is never linear, never guaranteed. Relapse is always a possibility, always lurking at the edges of a life trying to rebuild itself. The stress that drove Brandon to use drugs in the first place, the impossible demands of supporting a family on working-class wages, the physical exhaustion of oil field labor, the feeling of never being enough no matter how hard he tried, didn't go away just because he stopped using. Those stressors were still there, still grinding him down, still making him feel like he needed something, anything, to help him cope. In early August 2013, Brandon relapsed. The exact circumstances of how and why aren't publicly known. Whether it was a deliberate choice made in a moment of weakness, whether someone offered him drugs and he couldn't refuse, whether the stress finally overwhelmed his commitment to sobriety. What matters is that after 6 months clean, after working so hard to rebuild his life, Brandon used methamphetamine again. Kyle Lawson, Brandon's brother, would later confirm publicly that Brandon had taken methamphetamine shortly before his disappearance, acknowledging a painful family truth that many would prefer to keep private, but that was essential to understanding what happened on the night of August 8th. This detail about Brandon's drug use and recent relapse is crucial to understanding the events that followed, or at least to understanding the range of possibilities about what followed. Methamphetamine is a powerful stimulant that profoundly affects perception, judgment, and behavior. Users often experience intense paranoia, a feeling that they're being watched or followed, that people are plotting against them, that they're in danger when they're actually safe. This paranoid state can cause users to act in ways that seem completely irrational to outside observers, running from non-existent threats, hiding from imaginary enemies, making frantic calls about being chased when no one is actually pursuing them. Understanding that Brandon had recently used methamphetamine doesn't explain definitively what happened to him, but it provides crucial context for interpreting his statements and behavior on the night of August 8th. When he told his brother Kyle that people were chasing him, when he made that frantic 911 call about men pursuing him through the woods, when he ran from his truck into the darkness and refused to come out even when help arrived, were these responses to real threats, or were they the manifestations of drug-induced paranoia? This question would become central to all the theories about Brandon's disappearance. If the threats he perceived were real, if there really were people chasing him, then we're looking at a case of foul play, a crime with perpetrators who have never been identified or held accountable. If the threats were hallucinations, products of methamphetamine-saturated neurons, misfiring and creating ghosts that seemed terrifyingly real to Brandon, but existed nowhere except in his compromised brain, then we're looking at a tragedy of a different kind. A man whose addiction led him to run from imaginary danger into real peril, who died not from violence, but from the terrible consequences of his own compromised judgment. But there was yet another complicating factor in Brandon's life in August 2013, another piece of the puzzle that would influence his behavior on the night he disappeared. He had an outstanding felony warrant for his arrest. The exact nature of this warrant has not been fully disclosed in public reporting, whether it was for drug possession, for some other crime, for a probation violation, for failure to appear in court on a previous charge. What matters is that the warrant existed, that Brandon knew about it, that he faced the prospect of immediate arrest if he came into contact with law enforcement. An outstanding felony warrant hangs over a person's life like a dark cloud, coloring every decision, limiting every choice. Brandon couldn't just walk into a police station if he needed help. He couldn't call the cops if something happened. He had to avoid any situation where he might be asked for identification, where his name might be run through law enforcement databases, where he might be recognized. This meant living in a constant state of low-level anxiety, always looking over his shoulder, always calculating risks, always aware that any interaction with police could result in being handcuffed and taken to jail. The prospect of arrest meant not just the immediate loss of freedom, but all the cascading consequences that follow. Losing his job at the oil fields because he couldn't show up for shifts while in custody. Losing income that his family desperately needed. Facing legal costs he couldn't afford. Potentially being sentenced to prison time that would take him away from his children for months or years. For a man already struggling with addiction, already feeling like he was barely keeping his head above water, the threat represented by that warrant must have felt overwhelming. This fear of arrest would prove crucial to understanding Brandon's behavior on the night of August 8th and early morning of August 9th. When a sheriff's deputy arrived at his truck, Brandon's first instinct was to hide, to stay out of sight until the deputy left, to avoid being discovered. This decision, to hide from the person who might have been able to help him, may have been the last decision Brandon Lawson ever made. Had he not had that warrant, had he not been terrified of being arrested, would he have emerged from wherever he was hiding and gotten the help he apparently desperately needed? We'll never know, but the what if haunts everyone who examines this case closely. On the evening of August 8, 2013, Brandon arrived home in San Angelo sometime between 10:45 and 11 p.m. He had not come home the previous night, a fact that had worried and angered Ledessa. When he finally appeared, it was clear to Ledessa that he was using drugs again. After 6 months of sobriety, after all the promises and efforts and hope, he had relapsed. The argument that followed was the kind of fight that erupts when disappointment, fear, and exhaustion collide. The specifics of what was said during that argument have not been publicly detailed, but we know the broad contours. Ledessa was hurt, angry, frustrated by Brandon's choices. Brandon was likely defensive, caught between shame and defiance, between knowing he had let his family down and resenting being confronted about it. They were both exhausted from working long hours, from trying to raise 4 kids, from the relentless stress of trying to keep their heads above water, financially and emotionally. The argument escalated. Brandon, feeling cornered, wanting to escape the confrontation, made a decision. He would leave. He needed space, needed time to cool down, needed to be away from the judgment and disappointment he saw in Ledessa's eyes. Around 11:30 p.m., he called his father, who lived in Crowley, Texas, a 3-hour drive north of San Angelo on the outskirts of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Brandon told his father he was coming over, that he needed to get away for the night, that he would drive up and stay with him. Brandon's father, understanding that driving 3 hours after an argument, late at night, possibly while under the influence of drugs, was a terrible idea, tried to talk him out of it. Stay home. Work it out in the morning. Don't make decisions in the heat of anger that you'll regret later. But Brandon wouldn't be dissuaded. He was leaving. He was going to his father's house. That was final. At 11:54 p.m. on August 8, 2013, Brandon Lawson left his home in San Angelo, Texas, for the last time. He got into his silver Ford F-150 pickup truck, a working man's vehicle, probably showing the wear and tear of oil field work and hard miles. He pulled out of the driveway, heading north on U.S. Highway 277, a 2-lane road that stretches across West Texas, connecting small towns and ranches, cutting through landscape that in the darkness would have been almost completely black. Highway 277 between San Angelo and Bronte is a lonely stretch of road, especially late at night. There are few houses, fewer businesses, almost no traffic after midnight. The road passes through ranch land and open country, with occasional clusters of trees marking seasonal creeks, but mostly just flat or gently rolling terrain, covered in scrub brush and mesquite. At night, without streetlights, without moon or stars if clouds obscure them, this highway becomes one of those places where you can drive for miles and see nothing but your headlights cutting through absolute darkness. Brandon drove north. He probably had the radio on, or maybe he was alone with his thoughts, replaying the argument with Ledessa, thinking about his relapse, worrying about his kids, his mind racing with the effects of the methamphetamine still in his system. He was headed for Crowley, 3 hours away, but he would never make it there. About 40 miles into his journey, somewhere around 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, Brandon's truck ran out of gas. He was on Highway 277, a few miles south of the tiny town of Bronte in Coke County. Bronte is one of those small Texas towns that barely registers on most maps. A few hundred residents, a main street with a handful of businesses, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and not much happens. Just south of Bronte, on that desolate stretch of highway, Brandon's truck sputtered and died, coasting to a stop on the shoulder of the road with the rear bed extending slightly into the travel lane. Brandon must have realized immediately what had happened. The gas gauge in his truck had probably been dropping throughout the drive, a problem he had maybe noticed, but ignored or hoped would resolve itself once he reached a gas station in Bronte. But hope doesn't fuel trucks, and now he was stranded on the side of Highway 277 at midnight with no gas, no way to continue his journey, and no one around to help. He pulled out his cell phone and called his brother Kyle. Kyle Lawson lived in the San Angelo area, close enough that he could potentially come help Brandon, bring a gas can, get him back on the road. When Kyle answered, Brandon explained the situation. He'd run out of gas. He was stuck on Highway 277 south of Bronte. He needed help. But then Brandon said something that immediately alarmed Kyle. 3 guys are chasing me out of town. He later clarified, according to Kyle, that it was the Mexicans in the neighborhood. Kyle, knowing about his brother's recent drug use, asked if he was hallucinating. Brandon denied it, insisted that what he was experiencing was real, that people were after him, that he was in danger. Kyle didn't know what to make of this. Was Brandon really being chased, or was he experiencing the paranoia that often accompanies methamphetamine use? The brother Kyle knew the sober Brandon wouldn't make up stories about being chased, but the Brandon who had relapsed, whose mind was potentially flooded with stimulants, and whose judgment was impaired, might genuinely believe he was in danger when he wasn't. Kyle didn't have answers, but he knew he needed to help his brother. Kyle told Brandon he would come help him. Kyle woke up his girlfriend Audrey, gathered his 4-year-old child, and drove to Ledessa's house to pick up a gas can. Ledessa, still angry from the earlier argument, had already prepared for this possibility. She had anticipated that Brandon, leaving in anger without enough gas to make it to Crowley, would run out of fuel somewhere along the way. She had called Kyle earlier in the evening to warn him this might happen, and had placed a gas can on the porch for him to grab when the inevitable call came. Kyle, Audrey, and the child piled into their vehicle with the gas can and began the drive out to Highway 277 south of Bronte. It was now approaching 12:45 a.m., and the clock was ticking on what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in Texas history. As Kyle was preparing to leave to help his brother, Brandon was alone on the side of Highway 277, and something was happening that he perceived as a genuine threat. Whether that threat was real, whether there were actually men chasing him, whether he had witnessed something he shouldn't have, whether he had inadvertently stumbled into some kind of criminal activity, or whether the threat was a product of drug-induced paranoia, a chemical ghost created by methamphetamine flooding his brain, remains one of the central mysteries of this case. What we know for certain is that at 12:50 a.m. on August 9th, 2013, Brandon Lawson called 911. The The call was placed from Brandon's cell phone, and, due to the way emergency calls are routed in rural Texas, it rang at a nursing home in Robert Lee, a small town in Coke County, about 10 miles northwest of where Brandon was stranded. The person who answered was not a trained 911 operator, but a nurse working the night shift at the nursing home, someone who was serving as a volunteer dispatcher because rural counties often don't have the resources for dedicated 911 call centers staffed 24/7. The call lasted approximately 3 minutes, but much of what Brandon said was garbled, breathless, and difficult to understand. The audio quality was poor. Cell phone reception in rural Texas can be spotty at best, and Brandon was calling from an isolated stretch of highway with no nearby cell towers providing strong signal. Background noise, wind, Brandon's rapid breathing, and the general chaos of whatever situation he was in all contributed to making the call one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of audio evidence in modern true crime. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's response came immediately, the words tumbling out in a rush. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. The rest of this sentence is largely inaudible on the recording, though various attempts have been made to enhance the audio and decipher what he said. Some listeners believe he said, pushed some guys over. Others here pushed some cars over. Still others think he might have said something entirely different. What is clear is Brandon's next statement. Right here, going towards Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. And then chillingly, a guy's chasing me through the woods. Please hurry. The desperation in Brandon's voice is unmistakable. This is not someone calmly explaining a situation. This is someone who believes they are in imminent danger, someone whose voice carries the primal fear that comes from being prey. He sounds out of breath, like he's been running, his words coming in gasps. His tone conveys urgency, fear, and a desperate need for help to arrive as quickly as possible. The dispatcher, struggling to understand what Brandon was telling her, tried to get clarity. Okay, now run that by me one more time. Brandon spoke over her, his words overlapping with her question. There'll be no talking to him. I accidentally ran into him. The dispatcher, latching onto this phrase, repeated back, Oh, you ran into them? Okay. Then came one of the most debated sections of the call. Brandon said something that has been transcribed in multiple different ways by different listeners. Some here shot the first guy. Others here just the first guy, or got the first guy, or even not the first guy. The audio in this section is particularly garbled, and despite numerous attempts to enhance and clarify it, no definitive consensus has emerged about exactly what Brandon said. There's also debate about background sounds during the call. Some listeners insist they hear what sounds like a gunshot in the background. Others hear what might be a voice that isn't Brandon's, possibly saying something like "watch out" or "you there." These background sounds, if they exist, and if they can be accurately identified, would be crucial evidence about whether Brandon was alone or if there were others present during the call. The dispatcher, trying to assess the situation and determine what kind of help Brandon needed, asked, "Do you need an ambulance?" There's a brief pause in the recording, and some listeners report hearing what might be a background voice saying, "Yes," though this is heavily disputed. But then Brandon's voice comes through clearly. "No, I need the cops." The dispatcher followed up. "Okay, is anybody hurt?" There's another pause. Then the dispatcher repeats, "Hello? Hello? Hello? Brandon doesn't respond. The call goes dead. In the background of the recording, as the dispatcher is trying to regain contact with Brandon, some listeners report hearing a sound that gets progressively louder, as if something or someone is approaching the phone before the connection is lost. This 911 call, just under 3 minutes long, would become one of the most scrutinized pieces of audio in true crime history. It has been analyzed by professional audio engineers, enhanced using sophisticated software, debated endlessly on Reddit and true crime forums, and featured on countless podcasts and YouTube videos. Everyone who listens to it seems to hear something slightly different, and the ambiguity of the inaudible sections allows for wildly different interpretations of what happened to Brandon Lawson. What makes this call so haunting is not just its content, but its context. This was Brandon's last communication with the outside world. Whatever happened to him happened in the minutes and hours after this call ended. The call captures Brandon in what appears to be genuine distress, running from something or someone, desperate for help that would never arrive in time. Every word, every background noise, every ambiguous phrase potentially holds a clue to solving the mystery of his disappearance. But before help could reach Brandon, before his brother Kyle could arrive with the gas can, before anyone could make sense of what he was trying to say, the situation on Highway 277 was about to become even more complicated. At approximately 12:56 a.m., just 6 minutes after Brandon's 911 call, a truck driver traveling on Highway 277 called 911 to report a vehicle hazard. Brandon's silver F-150 was parked partially in the roadway, the rear bed extending over the white line into the travel lane. For a big rig traveling at highway speeds in the darkness, this was a dangerous obstacle, and the trucker did what responsible drivers do, reported it to authorities, so law enforcement could respond and prevent an accident. A Coke County Sheriff's deputy named Neil was dispatched to the location. He was responding not to Brandon's frantic call about being chased, but to the trucker's report about a vehicle partially blocking the road. This distinction would later become a source of controversy and frustration for Brandon's family. The 911 system had received 2 calls about the same location within minutes of each other, but somehow Brandon's desperate plea for help was categorized as a routine motorist out of gas call, while the trucker's report about a traffic hazard was treated as more urgent. Deputy Neal arrived at Brandon's truck around 1 a.m., though some sources place his arrival as late as 1:10 a.m. The exact timing becomes important later, but what's clear is that when the deputy arrived, Brandon's truck was there, but Brandon was not. At almost the exact same moment, Kyle Lawson and his girlfriend Audrey arrived at the scene with the gas can they had retrieved from Ledessa's porch. The scene that confronted Deputy Neal and Kyle was puzzling. Brandon's silver Ford F-150 sat on the shoulder of the highway, rear end slightly in the roadway, headlights off, engine silent. The doors were unlocked, a detail that would later be seen as significant, suggesting Brandon had left the vehicle in a hurry rather than taking the time to secure it. Inside the truck, there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. Brandon's keys were missing, suggesting he had taken them with him when he left the vehicle. His cell phone was also gone. Kyle approached Deputy Neal and explained the situation. He identified himself as Brandon Lawson's brother, explained that Brandon had called him because he'd run out of gas, and said he'd come to help. Kyle was still on the phone with Brandon at this moment, a detail that makes what happened next all the more bizarre and frustrating. According to Kyle, Brandon was still nearby, close enough to see his brother and the deputy. During their phone conversation, Brandon told Kyle, "I can see you. I'm right here." But when Kyle and Deputy Neal looked around, shining flashlights into the darkness surrounding the highway, they couldn't see Brandon anywhere. He claimed to be right there, within sight of the truck, but he was invisible to them. Kyle understood why Brandon might not come out of hiding while the deputy was present. He knew about Brandon's outstanding felony warrant, knew that his brother feared being arrested, knew that seeing a law enforcement officer at his truck would trigger that fear and cause Brandon to stay hidden until the deputy left. In the moment, this explanation made sense to Kyle. His brother was nearby, hiding in the brush or in a ditch, waiting for the coast to clear so he could approach safely and get the gas can without being taken into custody. But Kyle made a decision that he would later regret. He didn't tell Deputy Neal the full truth about the situation. He didn't mention that Brandon had talked about people chasing him. He didn't mention his concern that his brother might be hallucinating or in danger. He presented it as a simple case of someone running out of gas, probably embarrassed or afraid of the warrant, nothing to be too concerned about. Deputy Neal, accepting this explanation, did a brief search of the immediate area. He walked around the truck, shined his flashlight into the brush on both sides of the highway, looked for any signs of where Brandon might have gone. But in the darkness, with limited visibility and no indication of which direction Brandon might have traveled, the search was cursory at best. Finding nothing obvious and believing this was just a case of someone who had run out of gas and walked off to find help or to avoid the police, Deputy Neal returned to his vehicle and left the scene. Kyle and Audrey remained at the truck for a while, hoping Brandon would emerge from wherever he was hiding. Kyle called out to his brother, told him the deputy was gone, said it was safe to come out now. He left the gas can in the bed of Brandon's truck where Brandon could find it. He waited, parked a short distance up the road, giving his brother space to approach without feeling trapped. But Brandon never appeared. Kyle waited approximately 30 to 45 minutes, repeatedly calling his brother's phone, leaving voicemails, sending texts. For a while, Kyle could still reach Brandon, could hear his voice on the other end of the line, though Brandon wouldn't engage in substantive conversation. He would answer, say a few words, then hang up. His responses were terse, distracted, as if he was focused on something else, as if he couldn't or wouldn't explain what was happening. During one of these brief conversations, around 1:18 a.m., Brandon told Kyle he was bleeding. This statement would later be seen as crucial evidence that something violent had occurred, that Brandon had been injured, that whatever he was running from had caught up to him, at least enough to cause harm. But Kyle, unable to see his brother, unable to verify what was happening, didn't know how to respond to this information. He couldn't call for an ambulance because he didn't know where Brandon was. He couldn't help because his brother wouldn't tell him exactly where he was hiding. The calls between Kyle and Brandon became increasingly frustrating. Brandon wouldn't hold a conversation, wouldn't explain what was happening, wouldn't tell Kyle where to find him. Poor cell reception caused many calls to drop or go straight to voicemail. And then, after 1:19 a.m., all communication with Brandon ceased, completely. Every call Kyle made went straight to voicemail. Brandon's phone had either died, been turned off, or been taken out of service range. Brandon Lawson had effectively disappeared into the night. Kyle, exhausted, confused, and out of options, eventually decided to leave. He drove back home, assuming that Brandon would eventually return to his truck, get the gas from the can Kyle had left, and continue on his way. Maybe his brother needed space, needed time to deal with whatever he was going through. Maybe he was too high to think straight, too paranoid to come out of hiding, even for his brother. Kyle told himself that everything would be clearer in the morning, that Brandon would turn up with some explanation for his bizarre behavior. But morning came, and Brandon didn't turn up. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Brandon Lawson had vanished completely, leaving behind only his abandoned truck, a confusing 911 call, and a family that would spend the next 11 years desperately searching for answers. The initial investigation into Brandon's disappearance was marked by confusion, miscommunication, and what the family would later describe as a lack of urgency from local law enforcement. On August 12th, just 4 days after Brandon disappeared, the Coke County Sheriff's Office determined that Lawson was likely no longer in the county. This conclusion was based on what exactly? No one could quite explain. Brandon's truck was still where he had left it. His phone had last pinged towers in Coke County. He had no money, no vehicle, no way to travel any significant distance. But somehow, law enforcement decided he had left the area. On August 13th, one day after the sheriff concluded Brandon was probably gone, LaDessa Lofton filed an official missing person report. This was 5 days after Brandon had disappeared, 5 days during which the trail grew colder and the chances of finding him alive diminished. On the same day LaDessa filed the report, a Texas Ranger conducted an aerial search of the area using a helicopter, flying over the fields and brushlands surrounding the stretch of highway where Brandon's truck had been found. The ranger reported finding no body, no signs of anyone in distress, nothing to suggest where Brandon might be. But here's what makes this timeline so frustrating. Brandon's family didn't even know about the 911 call he had made until days later, after they obtained his cell phone records. Law enforcement, despite having received Brandon's frantic call about being chased, never informed the family that this call had occurred. The call had been logged in the system as a routine motorist out of gas situation, rather than as an emergency involving someone in danger. No one connected Brandon's 911 call with the report of his truck being found abandoned. No one realized that the man who had called for help was the same man whose truck a deputy had found less than 20 minutes later. When LaDessa finally saw the cell phone records and discovered that Brandon had called 911, she was devastated and furious. She contacted law enforcement immediately, demanding to know why no one had told the family about this call, why it hadn't been treated as the emergency it clearly was, why more hadn't been done to search for Brandon in those crucial first hours when he was still making and receiving phone calls, still alive, still able to be saved. The response from law enforcement was defensive and confusing. The local dispatcher, who had taken Brandon's call, became involved in a public controversy, posting on Facebook that reports about the case were inaccurate, claiming that LaDessa was lying about various details. The dispatcher seemed more concerned with defending herself and the handling of the call than with helping to find Brandon. The situation devolved into accusations and counter-accusations, with the family feeling that law enforcement was more interested in covering its mistakes than in finding their missing loved one. The sheriff's claim that Brandon had left the county was particularly galling to the family. They knew Brandon. They knew he wouldn't abandon his children, wouldn't disappear voluntarily, wouldn't leave his truck and his phone, and just walk away from his life. Yet the official position seemed to be that this was some kind of voluntary disappearance, that Brandon had run away, perhaps to avoid arrest on that outstanding warrant, and that he would turn up when he was ready. This theory ignored crucial evidence. There had been no activity on Brandon's bank accounts or credit cards since the night he disappeared. His cell phone, after 1:19 a.m. on August 9th, had never been used again, had never pinged another cell tower, had simply gone dark. Brandon's social media accounts remained untouched. He made no contact with friends, family, or anyone else. If he had truly left voluntarily, he had done so without money, without a vehicle, without his phone, without any of the resources a person would need to start a new life. On October 24, 2013, more than 2 months after Brandon's disappearance, an extensive search of the area around where his truck had been found was conducted. Law enforcement, volunteers, search and rescue teams, and family members spread out across the fields and brushland along Highway 277, looking for any sign of Brandon, his body, his clothing, his cell phone, anything that might explain what had happened to him. The search was thorough and methodical. They covered a wide area, moving through difficult terrain, checking ditches and culverts, looking under bridges, examining any place where a body might have been concealed or where someone in distress might have sought shelter. But, despite hours of effort, despite the commitment of dozens of people, the search yielded nothing. No trace of Brandon Lawson was found. The lack of evidence was baffling. Brandon had been on foot, possibly injured, in an area that wasn't that large or difficult to search. He couldn't have traveled far, especially if he was bleeding, as he had claimed in that final phone call to Kyle. Yet it was as if he had simply evaporated, leaving no physical evidence of his presence or his fate. Theories began to multiply as the case remained unsolved, each one trying to explain the inexplicable, trying to make sense of a situation that seemed to defy rational explanation. The first and simplest theory, the one that law enforcement initially seemed to favor based on the sheriff's statement that Brandon had probably left the county, was that Brandon had fled voluntarily to avoid arrest on his outstanding felony warrant. This theory had some surface plausibility. Brandon knew he had a warrant, knew that being caught meant going to jail, knew that any interaction with law enforcement put him at risk of arrest. The stress of the warrant, combined with his recent drug relapse and the fight with LaDessa, might have pushed him to a breaking point where running away seemed like the only option, where the prospect of facing his problems felt impossible. In this voluntary disappearance scenario, Brandon might have planned to hide out for a while, to lay low until he could figure out what to do about the warrant, about his relationship, about his life. Perhaps he thought he could start over somewhere else, find work under the table, send money back to his family once he got established, eventually find a way to resolve the legal issues and come home. It wouldn't be the first time someone facing arrest had chosen to run rather than face the music, had convinced themselves that disappearing was easier than dealing with their problems. But this theory, while superficially plausible, crumbles under even modest scrutiny. Where would Brandon go without money, without a vehicle, without his phone? His bank accounts showed no activity after the night of August 8th. No ATM withdrawals, no debit card transactions, nothing. If he had fled voluntarily, he had done so without accessing his own money. His credit cards similarly remained unused. He had no cash on him when he left his truck, at least none that's been documented. So if he was trying to start a new life somewhere, he was doing it with literally no financial resources. More damning to the voluntary disappearance theory is the sheer logistics of leaving. Brandon was on foot, on a desolate stretch of highway, miles from any significant town, in the middle of the night. How would he travel? He couldn't hitchhike without risking being remembered by whoever picked him up. He couldn't take a bus without money and without being captured on security cameras at the bus station. He couldn't just walk out of the area. The nearest city of any size was over 40 miles away, an impossible distance to cover on foot in the brutal Texas heat without water or supplies. And then there's the content of his 911 call and his conversations with Kyle. This doesn't sound like someone executing a plan to disappear. This sounds like someone in genuine distress, someone afraid, someone claiming to be chased and bleeding and in need of immediate help. Why would someone planning a voluntary disappearance make such calls? Why draw law enforcement attention to your exact location if you're trying to disappear? Why leave your truck with your brother and a sheriff's deputy standing right there if you're trying to vanish without a trace? Most importantly, why would Brandon choose to disappear in such a bizarre and frightening way when he could have simply driven to another city, abandoned his truck there, and disappeared into the anonymity of urban America? If the goal was to avoid arrest and start over, there were much more practical ways to do it than running into the brush off Highway 277 at 1 a.m. and never being heard from again. Finally, and most fundamentally, the voluntary disappearance theory ignores who Brandon was as a person. Everyone who knew him, his family, his friends, his co-workers, said the same thing. Brandon wouldn't abandon his children. He loved those kids. He worked himself to exhaustion for them. He talked about them constantly. The idea that he would just walk away from 4 children who needed their father, that he would choose to never see them again, to leave them wondering what happened to him, to deprive them of a father for the rest of their lives. It doesn't fit with anything we know about Brandon Lawson's character and values. LaDessa was emphatic on this point. He wouldn't leave his family. Brandon wasn't that type of person. And while partners sometimes don't know their loved ones as well as they think they do, while people sometimes surprise us with choices we never expected them to make, the consistency of this message from everyone who knew Brandon suggests that voluntary disappearance was simply not in his character. He had problems, yes. He was struggling with addiction, yes. He made mistakes and poor choices, yes. But abandoning his children? That crossed a line that those who knew him best didn't believe he was capable of crossing. The second major theory, and one that gained considerable traction, especially in the early years of the investigation, was that Brandon, under the influence of methamphetamine he had recently taken, experienced severe drug-induced paranoia and hallucinations that caused him to run into the brush, where he subsequently died from exposure, dehydration, exhaustion, or medical complications related to the drug use itself. This theory explains many elements of the case that the voluntary disappearance theory struggles with. Methamphetamine-induced paranoia is a well-documented phenomenon, particularly frightening because, to the person experiencing it, the threats feel absolutely real. Users describe being convinced that people are following them, that cars are tracking them, that strangers on the street are part of a conspiracy against them. They hear voices that aren't there, see shadows that move in threatening ways, interpret innocent sounds as evidence of danger. The paranoia can be so intense that users will barricade themselves in rooms, will run from imaginary pursuers, will call for help against threats that exist nowhere except in their compromised brains. If Brandon was experiencing this kind of methamphetamine psychosis, then everything he said and did on the night of August 8th, 9th makes a terrible kind of sense. The men chasing him weren't real people, but hallucinations or paranoid delusions. The danger he felt was a product of his brain chemistry gone haywire, not an actual external threat. When he ran from his truck into the darkness, he wasn't fleeing from real attackers. He was fleeing from ghosts, from shadows, from the terrible phantoms that methamphetamine creates in susceptible brains. In this scenario, Brandon might have run much farther than anyone would expect, driven by panic and the inexhaustible energy that methamphetamine provides in the short term. He might have become disoriented in the darkness, unable to find his way back to the highway, even when he wanted to. The poor cell phone reception in the area meant that even when he tried to call for help or communicate with his brother, the signal kept dropping, adding to his disorientation and panic. His statement that he was bleeding might have been real. Perhaps he injured himself while running through brush and scrub in the dark. Or it might have been another hallucination, another false perception created by his compromised state. Eventually, in this theory, the methamphetamine wore off, leaving Brandon exhausted, dehydrated, possibly injured, and lost in the scrubland. August in Texas is brutally hot. Daytime temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and even at night it often stays above 80. Without water, without shelter, a person can die from heat exhaustion and dehydration surprisingly quickly. If Brandon collapsed somewhere in the brush, unable to find his way back to the highway, unable to signal for help, he could have died within a day or two from exposure-related causes. The fact that his remains were found only 300 yards from his truck fits this theory reasonably well. 300 yards isn't far in absolute terms, just 3 football fields. But in darkness through rough terrain, while panicking and possibly injured, it's far enough to become completely disoriented and unable to find your way back. The scrubland around Highway 277 isn't uniform or easy to navigate. There are ravines and washes, thick patches of brush, rocks and cactus that make moving difficult, especially at night. Once you lose sight of the highway, once you can't see your vehicle or any other landmark, it's surprisingly easy to get turned around, to think you're heading back toward the road when you're actually moving parallel to it, or even away from it. This theory also explains why Brandon wouldn't come out of hiding when Kyle and the deputy were at his truck. If he was deep in the grip of paranoid delusion, he might have perceived even his own brother and the law enforcement officer as threats, as part of whatever conspiracy his drug-addled brain had convinced him was real. His statement to Kyle, "I can see you, I'm right here," might have been true. he might have been close enough to see the truck and the lights, but his paranoia might have prevented him from approaching, might have convinced him that coming out of hiding would result in his capture or death. The methamphetamine itself could have contributed directly to his death, even beyond the secondary effects of dehydration and exhaustion. The drug puts enormous strain on the cardiovascular system, causing rapid heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, and an increased risk of heart attack or stroke. Users, especially those who have used large amounts or who have underlying health conditions, can experience sudden cardiac events that are immediately fatal. If Brandon suffered a heart attack or stroke while hiding in the brush, death would have been relatively quick, and there would be no visible trauma on his skeleton to indicate the cause 9 years later. Proponents of the drug-induced paranoia theory point to several pieces of evidence that support this interpretation. Brandon's statements about being chased and needing police help could be explained as paranoid delusions. His refusal to come out when help arrived could be explained as paranoia preventing him from trusting even his own brother. The fact that no evidence of other people has ever been found, no witness reports, no other vehicles seen in the area, no physical evidence of anyone else present, suggests that perhaps there were no other people, that Brandon was alone the entire time, running from shadows only he could see. But even this theory, compelling as it is in many ways, has significant problems. The biggest challenge is Brandon's own insistence to Kyle that he wasn't hallucinating. When Kyle asked him directly if he was seeing things that weren't there, Brandon denied it. He was adamant that the threat was real, that people were really chasing him. Now, it's true that people experiencing psychosis often don't recognize that they're psychotic. By definition, psychosis involves a break from reality, where the person can't distinguish between what's real and what isn't. So Brandon's denial of hallucinations doesn't prove the threats were real, but it does complicate the drug paranoia theory slightly. More problematic for this theory are the possible background voices and sounds on the 911 call. Multiple audio analysts and thousands of online listeners have reported hearing what sounds like voices other than Brandon's during the 911 call, particularly a voice that seems to say, "You there," or "Watch out," right around the time the dispatcher is asking if Brandon needs an ambulance. If these background voices are real, and this is heavily disputed, with some people insisting they hear them clearly and others hearing nothing, then it suggests Brandon wasn't alone, that there were other people present during that call, which would contradict the theory that he was simply experiencing paranoid hallucinations. There's also the matter of the timing and the phone calls. Between 12:50 a.m., when he called 911, and 1:19 a.m., when his phone went dead, Brandon made and received multiple calls with family members. During these calls, while he was terse and wouldn't hold long conversations, he was lucid enough to communicate, to express that he was in trouble, to tell Kyle he was bleeding. This doesn't sound like someone completely detached from reality, unable to distinguish between real and imagined threats. People in the grip of full-blown methamphetamine psychosis typically have much more fragmented, incoherent communication. The third major theory, and the one that has gained the most traction among serious students of the case, among those who have spent hundreds of hours analyzing every available piece of evidence, is that Brandon encountered foul play. that the men chasing him were real, that the threat to his life was genuine, and that he was killed by people who had reason to want him dead or silenced. Online communities, particularly on Reddit and various true crime forums, have spent countless hours analyzing every aspect of Brandon's case and developing elaborate theories about what might have happened. One popular theory involves the Colorado River, which runs through Coke County, not far from where Brandon's truck was found. Some theorists believe Brandon might have been hiding near a bridge over the river when he made his calls. The bridge might have blocked cell signal, explaining the poor reception and dropped calls. And perhaps, some speculate, Brandon witnessed something near that river. People dumping bodies, conducting drug transactions, engaging in some other illegal activity, and was killed by people who couldn't afford to have a witness. This theory points to Brandon's statement in the 911 call about pushing guys over, and I ran into them. Some interpret this as Brandon describing a literal collision. He accidentally came upon people doing something illegal, disrupting their activity, and they pursued him as a result. The theory requires assuming that Brandon's location was closer to the river than his truck's position might suggest, but it provides a narrative framework that explains both the content of his 911 call and the outcome of his disappearance. Other theories have been proposed. Some believe Brandon was the victim of a random crime, perhaps by transients or criminals who happened to be in the area that night and saw him as an opportunity. Some think he might have had enemies, people who knew about his drug use and his vulnerabilities, and saw a chance to hurt him. Some even speculate about involvement by law enforcement, though this theory has less evidence and seems to stem more from general distrust of police handling of the case than from any specific facts. What all these theories share is an attempt to reconcile the known facts. Brandon's truck ran out of gas on Highway 277 south of Bronte around 12:30 a.m. on August 9, 2013. He called his brother for help and mentioned being chased. He called 911 at 12:50 a.m., sounding terrified and claiming people were after him. He made several more calls to family members between 12:50 a.m. and 1:19 a.m., during which he said he was bleeding and claimed he could see his brother but wouldn't come out of hiding. After 1:19 a.m., his phone went dead and was never used again. He disappeared completely, leaving no trace despite searches of the area. Whatever theory you believe, whatever explanation makes the most sense to you, the fundamental mystery remains. What happened to Brandon Lawson in those dark hours on Highway 277? And more specifically, what happened in the minutes after his phone went dead at 1:19 a.m.? That's when the answers, if they exist, lie buried. For Brandon's family, the years that followed his disappearance were marked by a mixture of desperate hope, crushing disappointment, and relentless advocacy. LaDessa Lofton became the public face of the search for Brandon, refusing to let his case fade into obscurity, refusing to give up on finding answers. She established a Facebook page called Help Find Brandon Lawson, which grew over the years to more than 29,000 followers. The page became a hub for information about the case, a place where tips could be shared, where theories could be discussed, where the community of people invested in finding Brandon could coordinate efforts. LaDessa posted updates regularly, shared memories of Brandon, kept his face and his story in front of the public. She understood that cases go cold when people stop caring, when the victim becomes just another statistic, when the family's voice is drowned out by the noise of new tragedies demanding attention. LaDessa also worked with private search teams, advocacy groups that specialize in helping families of the missing navigate the complex and often frustrating world of missing persons investigations. One such advocate was Jason Watts, who would eventually play a crucial role in the case. Jason and his team understood that sometimes finding answers requires going back to basics, walking the ground, searching areas that might have been missed or inadequately covered, following hunches and intuition rather than official protocols. For LaDessa, the years of not knowing were agonizing in a way that's difficult for outsiders to comprehend. She couldn't grieve Brandon's death because she didn't know for certain that he was dead. She couldn't move on because there was nothing to move on from, only absence, only uncertainty, only questions with no answers. She was stuck in limbo, unable to achieve closure, unable to tell her children definitively what had happened to their father. And the children, Brandon's 4 kids, grew up without their father, marking birthdays and holidays and milestones with his absence as a constant shadow over what should have been happy occasions. By 2022, the children who had been young when Brandon disappeared were teenagers and young adults. They had spent most or all of their formative years with an unanswered question hanging over their family. Where is Dad? What happened to him? Is he dead? Did he leave us? Why? The community support that rallied around LaDessa and the children was remarkable. People from around the world, from Texas, from other parts of the United States, from other countries entirely, followed Brandon's case, shared his story, offered prayers and support and practical help. This global community of advocates kept Brandon's name alive, ensured that law enforcement couldn't simply let the case gather dust, created pressure for continued investigation and search efforts. In February 2022, nearly 9 years after Brandon's disappearance, the breakthrough finally came. Jason Watts, the advocate who had been helping LaDessa, organized a private search team to comb the area around where Brandon's truck had been found. The team was small, about 10 people, according to reports, and they focused on searching ground that previous searches might have missed or inadequately covered. As they searched through the brush and rocky terrain about a mile from where Brandon's truck had been abandoned, they found something: clothing. Specifically, they found what appeared to be shorts and shoes that matched the description of what Brandon had been wearing on the night he disappeared. Brandon was last known to be wearing green camouflage shorts and white Nike tennis shoes. And here, nearly 9 years later, were items matching that description. The search team immediately contacted law enforcement. The Texas Rangers responded, widening the search around where the clothing had been found. And that's when they discovered what everyone had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure: human remains. The remains were described as partial: a skull cap, bones that had been scattered and degraded by 9 years of exposure to the elements, to animals, to the sun and rain and wind of the Texas landscape. They were found approximately 300 yards from where Brandon's truck had been abandoned, a distance that's both heartbreakingly small and large enough to have been missed by previous searches. The location, 300 yards from the truck, raises immediate questions about the initial search. How could remains be so close to where Brandon's truck was found and yet not be discovered for 9 years? How thorough were those initial searches? Did searchers not cover this particular area? Did Brandon's remains get scattered over time, moved by animals or weather events, so that they weren't all in one location? Or were the searches simply inadequate, conducted with insufficient resources or insufficient commitment? For Ledessa and the family, the discovery of remains was simultaneously a relief and a new source of anguish. If these were Brandon's remains, and in their hearts they believed they were, then at least they had an answer to the most basic question: where is Brandon? He hadn't run away. He hadn't started a new life somewhere else. He had died close to where his truck ran out of gas, had never made it far from that spot on Highway 277, had been there all along while his family searched desperately for him. But the discovery also raised new questions, perhaps more painful than the original mystery. If Brandon died so close to his truck, what killed him? Did he collapse from exhaustion or exposure or drug-related causes? Was he injured, dying slowly from blood loss as he lay in the brush just hundreds of feet from the highway? Or was he killed by someone, his body dumped or left where he fell? The remains were sent to the University of North Texas for DNA testing. This is where forensic science would finally provide the confirmation that the Lawson family needed. Were these remains Brandon's, or did they belong to someone else, adding yet another mystery to an already baffling case? But DNA testing of skeletal remains isn't always straightforward, especially when those remains have been exposed to the elements for years. Bones degrade. DNA breaks down. Extracting enough genetic material to create a profile that can be compared against family reference samples requires sophisticated laboratory techniques and sometimes multiple attempts. Brandon's father provided his DNA to be used as a reference sample for comparison. The testing began, and the family waited for results, expecting answers within weeks, or perhaps a few months. But weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years. The University of North Texas lab worked on the remains, but the condition of the bones, degraded by 9 Texas summers, weathered by exposure, potentially contaminated by soil and animal activity, made extraction difficult. The wait was excruciating. Having found what they believed to be Brandon's remains, having that physical evidence in hand, should have been the end of the uncertainty. But instead, the family found themselves in a new kind of limbo, waiting for laboratory confirmation of what they already believed in their hearts to be true. In December 2023, the family was told that the University of North Texas had been unsuccessful in extracting enough viable DNA from the remains to make a definitive identification. The samples were too degraded, the genetic material too fragmented. The lab couldn't say definitively whether the remains were Brandon's. The devastation of this news was profound. To have come so close, to have found remains, to have waited so long for confirmation, only to be told that science couldn't provide the answer they needed. It seemed impossibly cruel. But the Texas Ranger, in charge of Brandon's case, wasn't ready to give up. He made the decision to send the remains to a second laboratory, one with different techniques and technologies, hoping that a fresh approach might yield the results the first lab couldn't provide. The clothing that had been found near the remains, the shorts and shoes, was also tested for DNA. Perhaps fabric would retain genetic material better than bone had. Perhaps Brandon's DNA could be extracted from the clothing and used to make an identification. But these tests also came back inconclusive or negative. The years in the field had been too harsh, had degraded everything, had seemingly erased even the genetic signature that could confirm Brandon's identity. The second laboratory received the remains and began their analysis. The Lawson family waited again, trying to maintain hope while preparing themselves for the possibility of another disappointing result. Months passed. The family had learned not to expect quick answers, had learned that forensic science, for all its advances, still has limitations when dealing with remains this old and this degraded. And then, just before Christmas 2024, the phone rang. It was the Texas Ranger in charge of Brandon's case. He had news. The laboratory had succeeded where the first had failed. They had extracted enough DNA to create a profile. They had compared it against the reference sample provided by Brandon's father, and the results were definitive. The remains found in February 2022 were those of Brandon Lawson. After 11 years, 4 months, and 16 days, after 4,262 days of searching, hoping, praying, refusing to give up, the Lawson family finally had confirmation. Brandon was dead. They had found him. He had been there all along, just a few hundred yards from his truck, from the spot where his brother Kyle had waited in vain for him to emerge from the darkness. On Christmas Day 2024, LaDessa posted the announcement on the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page. She wrote about finally receiving the news the family had been waiting for, about the mixture of heartbreak and relief that comes with such confirmation. She thanked the thousands of people who had followed Brandon's case, who had kept his story alive, who had supported the family through over a decade of uncertainty. The news spread quickly through the true crime community. For the tens of thousands of people who had followed Brandon's case, who had listened to that haunting 911 call and wondered what had happened to him, the confirmation that he was dead brought a kind of closure, even as it left the most important questions unanswered. Because here's what the DNA confirmation didn't tell anyone. How did Brandon die? What happened in those minutes after his phone went dead at 1:19 a.m.? Were the men chasing him real, or were they paranoid hallucinations? Did someone kill him, or did he die from exposure, from exhaustion, from the effects of the drugs in his system? The forensic examination of the remains provided frustratingly little additional information. After 9 years of exposure to the elements, the bones were severely degraded. There were no evident signs of trauma, no bullet holes in the skull, no fractures that might indicate he'd been beaten or struck by a vehicle. But the absence of visible trauma doesn't mean trauma didn't occur. Soft tissue damage wouldn't be visible after 9 years of decomposition. If Brandon had been stabbed or strangled or died from internal injuries, those wouldn't necessarily leave marks on the skeleton. The cause of death was officially listed as undetermined. Toxicology analysis, which might have revealed what substances were in Brandon's system at the time of death, was not feasible given how long the remains had been exposed. The soft tissue where those substances would be present was long gone, weathered away by time and the elements. So even with the remains identified, even with the confirmation that Brandon had died not far from where his truck ran out of gas, the mystery of what actually happened to him remains. Was he running from real attackers and ultimately succumbed to injuries they inflicted? Did he die from complications of drug use, heart attack, stroke, seizure, while hiding in the brush? Did he simply collapse from exhaustion and exposure, dying slowly of dehydration in the Texas heat? We will probably never know the answers to these questions. The physical evidence that could tell us definitively what happened degraded long ago. The witnesses, if there were any, have never come forward. The 911 call, for all the thousands of hours people have spent analyzing it, remains ambiguous and open to interpretation. What we do know is that Brandon Lawson died on or shortly after August 9, 2013, within a few hundred yards of where his truck ran out of gas on Highway 277 south of Bronte, Texas. We know that his family searched for him for 11 years before finding confirmation of his fate. We know that his 4 children grew up without their father, that LaDessa Lofton spent more than a decade advocating for Brandon, refusing to let his case be forgotten. But the confirmation of Brandon's death didn't immediately bring his remains home to his family. After the DNA results were announced in December 2024, there were bureaucratic complications that prevented the remains from being released. Legal procedures, paperwork, jurisdictional questions, all the mundane machinery of death investigation and evidence handling, meant that even though the family knew where Brandon was, they couldn't have him back yet. The delays were frustrating and painful. Having confirmation that these were Brandon's remains, but not being able to claim them, not being able to lay him to rest, felt like yet another injustice in a case that had been marked by so many failures and frustrations. Finally, in July 2025, 7 months after the DNA confirmation, and nearly 12 years after Brandon's disappearance, the Coke County District Attorney released Brandon's remains to his family. On July 19, 2025, LaDessa posted an update on the Facebook page. After 4,362 days, we finally get to bring Brandon home. The outpouring of support from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people who had followed Brandon's case, who had never met him or his family, but who had become invested in his story, sent messages of condolence and support. The global community that had kept Brandon's case alive celebrated this bittersweet milestone with the family. Plans were made for a memorial service, a chance for family, friends, and supporters to gather and celebrate Brandon's life, to mourn his loss, to find some measure of closure in finally laying him to rest. The service was scheduled for August 30th, 2025, at Pathway Church in Burleson, Texas, a location chosen for its capacity and accessibility for the many people expected to attend. The family asked attendees to wear white, blue, and silver, the colors of the Dallas Cowboys, Brandon's favorite football team. It was a small detail, but an important one, a way of personalizing the service, of remembering Brandon not just as a victim or a mystery, but as a person with preferences and passions, someone who loved his kids and his Cowboys and his family. The memorial service, when it came, was attended by hundreds of people. Some had known Brandon personally, family members, old friends from San Angelo, co-workers from the oil fields. Others had never met him, but had followed his case for years, had spent countless hours listening to his 911 call and trying to understand what had happened to him. The service was a mixture of grief and celebration, of sorrow for a life cut short and gratitude for a mystery partially solved. LaDessa spoke at the service, thanking the community for never giving up on Brandon, for keeping his story alive, for supporting the family through the longest and darkest period of their lives. She talked about Brandon as a father, about how much he had loved his children, about how he would have wanted them to remember him. She acknowledged that there were still unanswered questions, still mysteries surrounding his death, but that, at least now, they could lay him to rest with dignity, could visit his grave, could have a place to go to feel close to him. The children, now teenagers and young adults, also participated in the service, sharing memories of their father, talking about what it had been like to grow up with his absence as a constant presence in their lives. They talked about the pain of not knowing, about the relief of finally having answers, about the bittersweetness of closure that comes more than a decade too late. And as the service concluded, as Brandon Lawson was finally laid to rest, the question that has haunted everyone who has encountered this case remained: what really happened on Highway 277 on August 9th, 2013? The 911 call continues to be analyzed, continues to be debated, continues to haunt everyone who listens to it. Audio engineers have attempted to enhance the recording, to clarify the inaudible sections, to determine what the background sounds are. Various transcripts exist, each claiming to have decoded what Brandon was trying to say in those garbled, frantic moments. What we can say with reasonable certainty is this: Brandon ran out of gas on Highway 277 around 12:30 a.m. He called his brother for help. Something happened, either real or imagined, that made him feel he was in danger. He left his truck and ran into the brush or fields near the highway. He called 911 at 12:50 a.m., sounding genuinely terrified, claiming people were chasing him. He made several more calls to family members, during which he said he was bleeding and claimed he could see his brother but wouldn't come out of hiding. After 1:19 a.m., his phone went dead. He died sometime thereafter, probably within hours, within a few hundred yards of where his truck sat abandoned. The question is, why? What was he running from? Were the men chasing him real? If so, who were they? And what did they want? If they were hallucinations, products of methamphetamine-induced paranoia, then how do we explain Brandon's insistence to Kyle that he wasn't hallucinating? How do we explain the apparent background voices on the 911 call? How do we explain that Brandon said he was bleeding? Was that real? Or was it part of the delusion? If Brandon died from drug-related causes, heart attack, stroke, seizure brought on by methamphetamine use, then the timing is remarkably unfortunate. He happened to experience this medical emergency at the exact moment he claimed to be running from attackers, happened to die in a way that left no obvious cause of death on his skeleton, happened to collapse in a location that wouldn't be found for 9 years despite being very close to his truck. If Brandon died from exposure and exhaustion, from running into the brush and becoming disoriented, from dehydration in the Texas heat, then why? Why didn't he return to his truck once he calmed down? Why didn't he wait for his brother? Why run so far from the highway that he couldn't find his way back? And if Brandon died from foul play, if he really was being chased, really was attacked, really was killed by someone who saw him as a threat, then who did it? What was the motive? Why has no one come forward, either to confess or to report what they saw? Why is there no physical evidence of another person's involvement? These questions may never be answered. The physical evidence is gone, degraded by time. The witnesses, if they exist, have remained silent for 12 years. The 911 call, for all its tantalizing ambiguity, doesn't provide clear answers. We are left with theories and speculation. with possibilities, but not certainties. What we can say with certainty is that Brandon Lawson's case stands as a reminder of how quickly a life can be derailed, how a series of bad decisions and unfortunate circumstances can cascade into tragedy. An argument with a girlfriend, a relapse into drug use, running out of gas on a lonely highway, fear of an outstanding warrant. Individually, these are manageable problems. Together, in the wrong sequence, they became fatal. Brandon's case also highlights the importance of families who refuse to give up, of communities that keep caring even when cases go cold, of advocates who are willing to go back and search ground that others have already covered. If Jason Watts hadn't organized that search team in February 2022, Brandon's remains might never have been found. If Ledessa hadn't kept his story alive on social media, hadn't maintained that Facebook page, hadn't given interviews, and kept pushing for answers, the case might have been completely forgotten. The fact that it took 9 years to find remains that were only 300 yards from Brandon's truck is troubling. It suggests that initial searches were inadequate, that law enforcement didn't commit sufficient resources to finding Brandon in those crucial first days when he might still have been alive. It suggests that once the sheriff decided Brandon had probably left the county, the case was essentially abandoned, left to the family to pursue on their own. This is a failure of the system, a failure that cost Brandon his life and cost his family years of unnecessary anguish. If the 911 call had been properly categorized, if the connection between Brandon's frantic call for help and his abandoned truck had been made immediately, if a proper search had been conducted in the first 24 hours, would Brandon have been found alive? We'll never know, but the possibility that he could have been saved makes the failures of that night all the more tragic. For the tens of thousands of people who have followed Brandon's case over the years, the confirmation of his death brought a measure of closure, but also a sense of profound frustration. A mystery that captivated the true crime community, that seemed like it might one day be solved, that hung on the interpretation of a single 911 call, has ended not with dramatic revelation, but with confirmation of death, and a cause listed as undetermined. The 911 call remains, preserved digitally, haunting everyone who listens to it. Brandon's voice, breathless and terrified, saying, "Please hurry," will continue to echo through the true crime community. A reminder of a young father who died alone in the brush beside a Texas highway, calling for help that never arrived in time. Brandon Lawson left behind 4 children who will never have the chance to know their father as adults, a partner who spent 11 years searching for him, a family that will forever wonder what really happened in those final moments. He also left behind a mystery that may never be fully solved, a 911 call that has been analyzed thousands of times without yielding clear answers, and a case that stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of never giving up. On August 30th, 2025, Brandon Lawson was finally laid to rest. After 12 years and 22 days, he came home. His family could finally say goodbye. His children could finally have a place to visit, to remember, to grieve. The community that had kept his story alive could finally close this chapter, could finally stop searching. But the questions remain. They haunt the night, just as Brandon's voice haunts that 911 call. What happened on Highway 277? What was Brandon running from? What did he see or think he saw that last night of his life? The answers, if they exist at all, went with Brandon into the Texas soil. All we're left with is his voice, 3 minutes of audio, breathless and afraid, calling out for help that would come 12 years too late. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones. The legacy of Brandon Lawson's case extends far beyond his family and the online communities that have followed it. The case has become a touchstone in discussions about how missing persons cases are handled, about the failures of rural law enforcement, about the ways in which substance abuse and poverty create vulnerabilities that are exploited or ignored by systems that should protect people. Brandon's story has been used as a case study in what not to do when someone disappears, how not to handle a 911 call, how not to conduct an initial search, how not to communicate with a victim's family. Law enforcement training programs have sometimes referenced Brandon's case when teaching about the importance of properly categorizing emergency calls, about connecting different pieces of information that come in separately but relate to the same incident, about the critical nature of the first 24 hours after someone is reported missing. The failures in Brandon's case, the 911 call categorized incorrectly, the disconnect between his frantic call for help and the discovery of his truck, the delay in conducting serious searches, serve as cautionary examples of how institutional failures can cost lives. The case has also sparked discussions about the resources available for searches in rural counties. Coke County, with a small population and limited budget, simply doesn't have the same resources for search and rescue operations that larger, wealthier counties can deploy. When someone goes missing in a major metropolitan area, authorities can mobilize dozens of searchers, bring in helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, deploy drones with cameras, use cell phone tracking technology to narrow search areas. In a rural county like Coke, resources are stretched thin, and searches often rely heavily on volunteers who may or may not have proper training or equipment. This disparity in resources means that your likelihood of being found if you go missing depends partly on geography, not just the terrain where you disappear, but the administrative and financial capacity of the jurisdiction responsible for looking for you. Brandon disappeared in a county without the resources to conduct the kind of exhaustive search that might have found him in those critical first days. Whether he could have been saved if such a search had been conducted is unknowable, but the possibility that inadequate resources contributed to the delay in finding his remains is deeply troubling and raises questions about equity in law enforcement services. The case has also highlighted the role that private citizens and advocacy groups can play in keeping cases alive and pushing for answers when official investigations stall. Jason Watts and his search team, who finally found Brandon's clothing and remains in 2022, operated outside official law enforcement channels, conducting their search as concerned citizens using their own time and resources. The fact that private searchers found remains that law enforcement searches had missed for 9 years speaks both to the dedication of these advocates and to the limitations of official search efforts. This citizen involvement in missing persons cases has become increasingly common in the age of social media and true crime media. Families of missing persons now routinely turn to Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms to build communities of supporters, to share information, to maintain visibility for their loved ones' cases. These online communities can exert pressure on law enforcement, can generate tips and leads, can provide emotional and practical support to families navigating the nightmare of having someone they love disappear. But this democratization of investigation also has downsides. The same online communities that keep cases alive can also spread misinformation, can harass people falsely suspected of involvement, can traumatize families with insensitive speculation or conspiracy theories. The balance between helpful civic engagement and harmful amateur sleuthing is delicate, and Brandon's case has sometimes illustrated both sides of this dynamic. The 911 call recording has taken on a life of its own in true crime circles, becoming almost iconic. A piece of audio that represents the frustrating ambiguity at the heart of so many unsolved cases. It's been featured in countless YouTube videos, dissected in forum posts, running to hundreds of pages, referenced in discussions of other cases where crucial evidence is ambiguous and open to interpretation. For people interested in true crime, Brandon's 911 call has become required listening, a case study in how sometimes the evidence we have raises more questions than it answers. This attention has kept Brandon's memory alive in ways that might not have been possible 20 or 30 years ago. Before the internet age, before social media and true crime podcasts, a case like Brandon's might have faded from public consciousness fairly quickly, remembered only by family, and perhaps covered briefly on local news. But in 2013 and beyond, Brandon's case could go viral, could reach millions of people, could become the subject of detailed investigation by amateur and professional researchers around the world. Whether this attention helps solve cases or just creates noise and distraction is an open question. In Brandon's case, the attention didn't lead to his being found. That happened through private searchers doing ground-level work rather than through online sleuthing. But the attention kept pressure on authorities, kept the case from being completely forgotten, ensured that when remains were discovered, there was a community of people ready to support the family through the identification process and beyond. For Ladessa and Brandon's children, the attention has been both comforting and overwhelming. Comforting because it means Brandon's life and death matter to people beyond just his immediate family, because it means he won't be forgotten, because it means there's a community of support when they need it. Overwhelming because it means living their private grief in public, because it means dealing with strangers who think they understand the case better than the family does, because it means having to repeatedly revisit the worst moments of their lives as new people discover the case and ask the same questions that have been asked 1,000 times before. The children, who have grown up without their father, have had to navigate an unusual situation where thousands of strangers know their father's name, have listened to his final desperate calls for help, have theories about what happened to him. They've had to grow up with their family tragedy being public property, with people online discussing intimate details of their father's struggles with addiction and the circumstances of his death. This is a unique burden that families of famous or highly publicized victims carry: the inability to grieve privately, the constant re-traumatization as the case is discussed and debated in public forums. As of August 2025, with Brandon finally laid to rest, With the memorial service completed and the immediate crisis of not knowing where he is finally resolved, the family faces a new challenge: learning to live with the answers they have, while accepting that some questions will never be answered. They know where Brandon is now. He's home, buried, finally at peace. They know he died somewhere near where his truck ran out of gas, that he didn't abandon them, that he was trying to get help. That whatever happened to him happened quickly after his phone went dead. But they don't know why. They don't know if he was running from real threats or imaginary ones. They don't know if someone killed him or if he died from the combined effects of drugs, panic, exhaustion, and the unforgiving Texas environment. They don't know what those final moments were like, whether he suffered, whether he thought of them, whether he knew he was dying. These unanswered questions will haunt them forever, and while they've achieved a measure of closure in bringing Brandon home, the mystery of what actually happened on Highway 277 on August 9, 2013, remains as impenetrable as ever. The case remains officially open. The Texas Rangers have never closed it, have never declared that they've determined what happened to Brandon. The cause of death listed as undetermined means that legally all possibilities remain on the table: accident, suicide, homicide, death by misadventure. Without definitive evidence pointing to one explanation over others, without witnesses coming forward, without some breakthrough in physical evidence or forensic analysis, the case will likely remain in this state of unresolved uncertainty indefinitely. This is frustrating for everyone who has followed the case, who has invested time and emotional energy into understanding what happened, who has hoped that eventually the truth would emerge. The 911 call seemed like it should provide answers. It's right there, Brandon's voice, his description of what's happening to him. But the ambiguity of the audio, the inaudible sections, the multiple possible interpretations of what he said and what background sounds are present, means that the call raises as many questions as it answers. It's a Rorschach test, with different listeners hearing different things based on what they believe happened or want to believe happened. Perhaps future technology will allow for better analysis of the audio, for clarification of sections that currently remain indecipherable. Perhaps advances in forensic science will allow for new analysis of Brandon's remains that could provide more information about how he died. Perhaps someone who knows something will finally come forward, unburdening themselves of a secret they've carried for years. Perhaps some piece of evidence that was overlooked or misunderstood will be re-examined and yield new insights. Or perhaps the mystery of what happened to Brandon Lawson will remain unsolved forever, joining the ranks of cases where we know someone died, but we'll never know exactly how or why. Perhaps that 911 call will continue to haunt the true crime community indefinitely, will continue to be listened to and debated and analyzed without ever yielding clear answers. Perhaps Brandon's children will grow old without ever knowing exactly what happened to their father, will pass that uncertainty on to their own children, will leave behind a family legacy of mystery and unanswered questions. What we can say with certainty is this: Brandon Lawson was a father, a partner, a son, a brother, a human being with value and dignity, beyond his role as a victim in a mysterious case. He worked hard to support his family. He struggled with demons that eventually contributed to his death. He loved his children and his partner. He was flawed and human and deserving of compassion. The circumstances of his death may remain mysterious, but his life and the love he had for his family are not mysterious at all. They're clear and documented and remembered by those who knew him. His legacy is his children, who carry his memory forward. His legacy is the lessons his case might teach about how to better handle missing persons cases, about how to properly resource rural law enforcement, about how to treat families with compassion when they're at their most vulnerable. His legacy is the community of people who have kept his story alive, who have refused to let him be forgotten, who have shown that even strangers can care deeply about justice for someone they never met. And perhaps his final legacy is a reminder about the fragility of life, about how quickly things can go wrong, about how a series of bad choices and unfortunate circumstances can cascade into tragedy. Brandon's death could perhaps have been prevented at multiple points. If he hadn't relapsed into drug use, if he hadn't gotten into that argument with LaDessa, if he'd checked his gas gauge, if he'd waited at his truck for Kyle instead of running into the darkness, if the 911 call had been properly handled, if the initial search had been more thorough. At each point, a different choice or different outcome might have changed everything. But we live in the world where all those choices were made, and all those circumstances aligned in the worst possible way, where Brandon ran out of gas at the wrong place at the wrong time, where whatever he encountered in the darkness proved fatal, where help arrived too late to save him. We live in the world where 4 children grew up without their father, where LaDessa spent 11 years searching for answers, where a family was torn apart by tragedy and uncertainty. On August 30th, 2025, at that memorial service at Pathway Church in Burleson, dressed in Dallas Cowboys colors, Brandon's family and the community that had kept his memory alive gathered to say goodbye. They celebrated his life, mourned his loss, and found what measure of peace was possible given the circumstances. They acknowledged that, while they finally had some answers, they would never have all of them, and that was something they would have to learn to live with. Brandon Lawson is home now, laid to rest, his location no longer a mystery. But the mystery of what happened in his final hours remains preserved forever in that haunting 911 call, in the unanswered questions about whether the men chasing him were real or imagined, in the gap between the last time he spoke to his brother and the discovery of his remains 9 years later. The audio of his 911 call continues to circulate on the internet, continues to be listened to by people encountering his case for the first time, continues to generate theories and debates and analysis. His voice, breathless and terrified, saying, "Please hurry," will echo through the true crime community for years to come. A permanent reminder of a life cut short, of a family left behind, of questions that may never be answered. Thanks for being here and listening to Brandon's story. His life mattered. His children deserved to have their father remembered. And perhaps, somewhere in the retelling of his story, in the continued attention to the mysterious circumstances of his disappearance, there's a chance, however slim, that someone who knows something will finally come forward and give his family the complete answers they've been searching for since that terrible night in August 2013. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe, take care with your loved ones, and remember that every missing person is someone's child, someone's parent, someone who deserves to be found and brought home.